Let's go. Welcome to another episode of the OoruLabs podcast from Bengaluru. Ever complain how bad our cities are, how bad your commute is? You will get to hear from people who are working to solve these problems in their own way. This is your weekly soapbox for urban sustainability. I am Satya Sankaran with Nirav Kodolikar. The term fourth estate or fourth power refers to the press and the news media both in explicit capacity of advocacy and implicit ability to frame political issues. Printed newspapers have been around from the 17th century. Broadcast electronic media in the form of radio and TV began in the 19th century. Over the past few decades, however, the internet has changed the shape of communication and the fourth estate itself. You're right now listening to one such format today. But to talk about all this and shine a light of how this has played a part in our city and in the urban milieu of how people consume news and how they have evolved over times, we are joined today by Rasheed Kappan. He was the civic affairs editor at Deccan Herald. He's an independent multimedia journalist. He has over 28 years of journalistic experience in various newspapers like the Times of India, the Hindu, Deccan Herald, the News Laundry, the Federal, and the Probe. He has written hundreds of articles around urban issues, especially mobility, and I've had the fortune of interacting with him on many of these. He's also the co-founder of Art Bengaluru Collective and Kappansky Media. Welcome to the show, Rashid.
Hi, Satya. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
I would like to actually start off with this question that is on everybody's minds now when we talk about news. Is the newspaper dead?
It's a very black and white question, I would say. But then, being in the industry for the last, 29, almost 3 decades, I can say that the newspaper is on its last legs. But then the legs will continue to walk for the next 5 to 10 years at least. There is still a big proportion of people, of the population, who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who have grown up reading the newspaper along with a cup of tea in the morning, right? So as long as they are there, the newspapers are going to be there. But in what proportion, I don't know. So the people, as long as those who are in their 40s, when they become 50s and 60s, they can still afford to buy a newspaper, right? So as long as that happens, I think the newspaper will be there. But the circulations are coming down. Even the largest circulated dailies have reported a fall in their circulation. But next couple of years and next 5 years is going to be very crucial.
So what has taken its place? Has that happened to the print media in general? Like what about magazines and weeklies and those kind of fortnightlies and things like that? And also what's happening to the electronic media as well, right? Even that is being shaken up a little.
Yeah. So if you look at the magazines, the standalone magazines have hardly made money, even in the best of times, right? So even the big, they are linked to the mainstream newspapers and often write piggyback on these newspapers, right? They're struggling and many of them have closed down. But then there are newspapers which, for instance, publish from Delhi as a mechanism to have some kind of influence there. They don't make money out of magazines. But then being in Delhi itself gives them that leverage to be close to the powers that be, So that way, some of the newspapers are, surviving. But I don't think as a standalone platform, magazines are finding it easy now. They are finding it even tougher than newspapers.
But that challenge has not been there with TV or radio, right? How do you see that going with this internet thing?
Now, newspapers are, of course, trying out the digital method, kind of hybrid reporting. Digital, of course, is a different animal itself. But then many of those electronic media giants, they have also diversified. They have found the competition increasing. You have many more news channels competing to get the eyeballs, right? That race is going on. But I would say that is going to morph into different kind of platforms, including the digital, even television. Because if you look at NDTV, many people watch NDTV television online on the website and on your mobile phones, right? The platforms are changing, and I feel this is going to influence even the newspapers as well. And it's happening right away.
Speaking to the decline that you just mentioned, Rashid, I was wondering if you had any figures on what the decline actually looks like over the last, say, 3 to 5 years. Even if it's ballpark, that's fine. But if you look at a traditional newspaper and you mentioned that they are in a decline, would you happen to have some figures on what it looks like?
I wouldn't be able to give you the exact figures, but
Sure.
during the lockdown years, during even the post-pandemic years, the cost of newsprint has almost doubled, right?
Okay.
So the bulk of newspapers' cost is a newsprint, which they try to make it up through advertisement. Circulation is to produce a newspaper copy. It costs about 12 to 15 rupees, and you get back just about 5 6 rupees. So the main revenue source is the newspaper ads, and many of the smaller newspapers depend on the government tender ads, which of course is not doesn't pay much. In terms of newsprint cost, the balancing has been extremely tough, and that has impacted the salaries, the number of people, number of reporters the newspapers can afford. By consequence, it has also impacted the coverage of certain sections which they deem it as not important.
But from a role that the newspapers played, right, there was reporting that the public used to gain. So you get out to office every day. Before that, you get to know what is going on in the day's newspaper. Like you said, with a cup of coffee, we were able to gather all of this information. And the only way people interacted with newspapers was mostly one way, but they also used to do this letters to the editor kind of a thing where they would chime in and you would publish. You have been a civic affairs editor. You have looked at urban interactions with newspapers. How was that, and how did that shape up over the years?
I started when there was no internet, right? Google was still it was still a baby, right? That demanded a lot of physical research. We go to the archive section, actually look at the old newspapers, or even speak to veteran journalists in your own office, try to get some perspective or context to a story. But in that age of internet, of course, the initial years was like many of these stories are cyclical, so it keeps repeating every year. You can often see that many of the, I wouldn't say all reporters, there are reporters who will just cut and paste the previous year's thing and then change the first few paragraphs, because
Mm,
the procedure, the methodology, everything is same. Now when the internet came,
mm,
no, I remember my first story.
mm,
First story was on a school which didn't have exams till 10th standard, So it was a
mm,
story in the Times of India. And I got letters, physical letters from all across India. And then we had landline calls through from morning till night to the office coming in. Because a lot of parents were interested because it was a unique concept, right? As internet has matured and the platforms have increased, and in social media, of course, you have these reactions come in a flood. What you get in an entire day, you get in half an hour. So that also, of course, depends on how active you're on social media. So many journalists who are like veterans pre-internet age, they couldn't keep pace with the changes in the internet.
mm,
While I tried my best to be catch up, right? So I try to build an audience on all social media platforms, and that has helped amplify my stories, and also reactions come in thick and faster. But I don't know how many reporters have tried that, but whoever has done that has found that it's a very, because you get instant feedback almost, like
mm,
even if you get a story, and there are people who are calling out any checks and balances come in thick and fast, right? If there's a small mistake, there are people who coming in, messaging you, or coming directly on Twitter platforms and telling, okay, there's a mistake there. So those kind of corrections are there, but there are also a flip side
mm,
where there are also a lot of young reporters get influenced by sensationalist tweets or Facebook stories, and they rush and package the story to an editor who is completely impressionable for a front page story. And the next day, the story is, the person who put that story first in the social media backs out. So, how do you tackle with these kind of issues? So, with the internet age, all these complexities have come up. How you deal with it is the way how mature you are, how tech friendly you are as a chief reporter or an editor.
I also saw this. Somebody else tell me on the other flip side is sometimes political pressure is also exerted to take back something, right? If you are an electronic media, you have to take it back quickly. But if the print went out in the morning, you can't do anything much. You have to write a recall some more time, but the word is out already. So there are drawbacks. But that brings me to the question of in a city kind of an environment where an urban environment is fast changing, there are a lot of people today consuming news online and things. How do you think the newspaper can provide any value? I know it is on the last legs and whatever it is.
Now, ironically, the growth of television has, in a way, given back the value of newspaper. You know,
Hmm.
so we have the noise of the television studios, right? Which everybody knows. The 9 p.m. show is like a noise, right? Competing noises, and there are so many channels in so many languages. So people don't have the ability to, absorb all this in such a short time. And unlike a newspaper, you don't need to subscribe to each channel. You just have to flip through your remote control and the channels keep coming. Whereas in a newspaper, you have a curated set of articles which is neatly ordered, designed well, with a kind of visual hierarchy in each page. So you know which story to go first, which story to go second, how much time you need to spend on each story. Now, that gives a sense of balance, a perspective, and a sense of purpose to the reader, which you can't see in a television, which depend on stories brought by reporters who thrust a mic into a politician's mouth and he blurts out something in haste. That becomes the story of the day or might weeks. For the next 1 week, entire studios will be talking about the same bite. But newspapers have come back to that value chain by giving clarity, depth, and purpose and meaning.
I want to touch upon that other side of things is right. Let's say there's a newspaper which is writing. You are all based in big cities now, right? The newspaper offices, and they obviously have to deal with a lot of government agencies, right? There's a lot more things happening in a city on the bureaucratic side of things, and than in the smaller cities and towns where the civic infrastructure is not that big of a story, though now it is becoming big. Has it How is your relationships with bureaucrats, and how does that impact how you report? Do you get more news? Are you able to tap into that, and how does that come across in a newspaper? Let's talk about the newspaper, then we'll get into the other media. Does that help provide more value to the newspaper? Because normal citizens don't have, they can see what's around them and talk about that, but then they rely on press to come back and say what is the other side saying, what is the government saying. And now, of course, with the social media, there is a direct, the elected people are also tweeting. Some of the officials might be tweeting, some of them don't, but even if they do, they don't tweet about the work. I think there are some challenges in them trying to address the people directly, but the politicians are on Twitter. How do you see the government part of it from the press side?
See, the print side, by its very nature, is invisible in the sense it is not very visual. So it's not like it's not there right in front of you. A story doesn't unfold that way, like in television. A reporter can work on a story for days or weeks. He can chase a story, and there are government sources will reveal stories because he can maintain his anonymity, which is not possible in a television or a online site. He can give you authentic information which the reporter knows that is true, and then he can put it in a fashion which is digestible to the audience. Now he has the luxury of time to do that, unlike television people do also do documentary stories and all. There are multiple ways of doing it, but it costs a lot of time and money. Whereas if you're a journalist, and a print journalist especially, you can continue to do these stories, and the source will keep giving you feeding information which is extremely difficult for a TV journalist to chase on a day-to-day basis, because the deadlines of a TV journalist is much more stringent than a print journalist. that in a way also helps the print journalist, because he has the ability to look at multiple sides of the same story, also amplify and present the story in a very accessible way in the next day's newspaper. For instance, you are chasing a story which is very difficult to understand for a lay person. He can use infographics, or in a digital age you can also look at animated infographics and explainers. Many of the newspapers now have explainers of fundamental topics which you can't understand. Whereas in a television, for instance, your major news breaks in a particular very a topic which is not a layman's terms. So there's no time to explain that the same day, and by that time the next day is there, it's already old news, right? Whereas in the newspaper has the luxury, you can allocate an entire page in a or half a page to explain that story. That's keep happening now, and I think that's a plus point for a print journalist.
This brings me to the whole new age of the internet, really, right? There is the web, there is the social media, then there is the visual platforms like YouTube, right? How do you see them as a express person and a person who's in the media space trying to do either journalism or reporting or just explaining things to people or having conversations like this? That is one. And how do you see citizens using this media? You wanted to add to that?
No, yeah, and maybe to add to this, with particular reference to a frequency of a story, just to elaborate on what I'm saying. So, by definition, a newspaper, I would say the frequency of a story being released to the public would be on a daily basis. If something happens today, it's going to be in the newspaper tomorrow, first thing in the morning. But as someone who has been born and brought up through the through the phasing out tail end of a newspaper, I've seen the rise of many of these groups and sort of civic activism groups. For example, there might be a group on Twitter talking about bus frequency and bus status in a particular city. And the frequency of updates on such groups are even at a second per second basis. So if there is a particular line or a particular bus that is broken down somewhere, it'll immediately be on this group. And this is something by definition a newspaper can't do. Could you talk to the value add of such groups and what you think about the rise of these groups on social media and just these high frequency story outputs, and what maybe the pros and cons of something like this can be?
Yeah. So since you mentioned about civic activist groups in terms of when a bus breaks down or that kind of
Yes.
thing, right? If you look at this, this is a very positive development, because citizen journalism itself has evolved, and with the multiplicity of platforms now, you have the WhatsApp, we have Telegram groups, you have the Clubhouse, and you have Twitter Spaces. There are a lot more platforms. In many ways you can address what's happening. I think it is a symbiotic relationship between the journalist and these kind of citizen journalists. Okay, so many of these journalists are part of these groups. They are also members. I myself am member of 2-3 dozen groups. Of course, it's a
Oh, I see.
lot more information there, but then I know which group to tap for a particular story. I can look at the conversations happening and build a story around it, and identify the person who has said that and speak to him separately. If you're looking at print journalism as a means to give these updates, most of the newspapers have gone digital, and they do give updates. For instance, if there's a budget happening, you have every 10 minutes you have the highlights and ramifications of the budgetary announcement, how it impacts the people. All that keeps coming in, and there are at least in the West, I think it's going to come here as well. Many of the interactive maps are there on these websites, and most of the newspapers have mobile apps now, right? Now, this doesn't need to be standalone. They don't need to stand alone. They can be part of these groups as well. And it's often the competition what you see among newspapers. There's no such competition when people put up a link. Today they might put up a link, another person might put up a link from Deccan and Times. The reporters might be competing with each other, but these groups, what they synergize these developments into one WhatsApp group, so people know what's happening from multiple perspectives. And I feel in that way, a very well-rounded journalism is evolving. The only flip side, as I mentioned earlier, is that the need to check these facts, you know, and often people who are in the group, they are aware that certain basic things are well in line, unless it's very controversial and political. Political, of course, fact checking is a must, without which, there are multiple ways to manipulate it.
As a thorough journalist by trade, who's been in the field for, X many years, if you had one note to give to the modern citizen journalist, what would that be? I hope this isn't putting you too much in the spot, but if you've had a thought on this, I'm very curious to know.
No, it's like, stick to facts and be objective as humanly possible. I'm not sure any journalist you can say that he's the most objective journalist in Bangalore or anywhere, because the way we tackle, the more and more deeper you go into a topic, it becomes extremely difficult to take sides. Stay neutral. There are some fundamental questions of ethics: what is good, what is bad, what is good for the city, what is bad for the city. Now, for instance, you're talking about sustainable mobility. Now, a car maker says that you are being biased. A person who's obsessed with good roads, flyovers, will say that you are biased, because when you talk against flyovers, right? So these kind of issues will obviously put you in a dilemma if you're a journalist who's just starting off. But if you're a seasoned journalist, you have seen the issues at great depth, you know what you're talking is right, okay, and you are happy with that bias. You know that what you're saying, you have the conviction that what you say is right, and you would want to let your listeners get that, well-rounded approach to a particular problem.
As a person who reports on issues in a city or a large urban agglomeration, you are also serving an audience which is different from reporting on political happenings or any other happenings like law and order and different things, right? Your page 3 or whatever that page is for the city news and state news and things like that. It is revolving around civic, urban affairs and things like that. Now, in the age of the internet, of course, it is just about not putting the same newspaper out in digital form. It is also about using visual forms. It is also about using other modes. As a journalist, does the way you want to convey the information to a busy citizen differ in these three modes? Are mainstream media able to use all the three modes, or are they just taking the newspaper, putting it out there and charging a subscription fee behind a paywall? Is the diversification in India at least happening at a fast pace? Are all of them able to leverage all of them? Because it takes a cost to do each of them separately. And are they complementary? Are they able to do? Because I'm increasingly seeing a lot of your colleagues in the news are switching to podcast, are switching to their own channels to report things, urban or otherwise. They see that it is instant and they are able to reach more people, because I'm more connected on my device, because I haven't had a newspaper for 10 years. I had some till 2018. That's my dad used to read, and then it hasn't been around. I haven't had a TV for the last decade at least. I haven't watched one. I don't even have it at home, and I've been mostly consuming online. And like I said, I think it's increasingly becoming only 60 years plus, not even 40, 50. I do have a few colleagues who are still trying to have their newspaper with their coffee. But beyond the newspaper, let's try and address that. Has the mainstream media able to adjust to this, adjust to these multiple forms?
Yeah, they are forced to get into the digital mode increasingly, and there are newspapers which have completely offloaded reporters to bring in video editors and video producers and podcasters. They have cut short the number of reporters, which used to be 12 to now 5 or 6 or 7, and they have invested heavily in studio equipment, very professional grade video cameras and lighting and sound systems. The way the news flows and news happens these days, that a very badly made shaky video can go viral and spark news. A journalist or a person deciding on these news platforms should understand that investing in equipment alone won't suffice. You need to go out there and catch the story in whichever way it is, you know. So mobile journalism, they call it mojo. Of course, many of the smartphones now are can capture news and different kind of things at great variety and range. So it's in the way you capture the essence of news in a way which is appealing to the generation which is 20 years and above, or even less, because teenagers know better than us how the platforms work. So what you mentioned is right. The consumption age of a newspaper is now advanced. So I mentioned very hopefully it was 30. It could be 40, 50, and of course 60. And beyond 60, they are no longer the decision makers in the house. So even if a 60-year-old person wants a newspaper, his son might say, no, sorry. We have a few more years to reach that stage. The teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s are increasingly looking at news in capsule forms. They want to know what's happening around them, and they will only go deeper if it interests them, if it impacts them in some way. And there are many platforms, apps like InShots, which will give you what a reporter takes the entire day chasing stories, going from here and there, spends the entire day spending a lot of money, is made into a 10-second capsule. Now we have to live with this. This is going to increase, right? Now that's one way of looking at it. But there are also newspapers which are looking at identifying these consumption patterns and kind of designing the news in that way, fashion. So you have Instagram, YouTube Shorts, and even stories which come in textual animation, stories, deeper stories, explainers come explained in very simple layman's graphics. What you say, reels on Instagram, can be made in a news format itself. So,
Mhm.
but the thing is, you are increasingly getting short of time in grabbing those eyeballs. Today's children have only a few seconds allotted to journalism. That's why I keep saying that we need a different kind of secondary education.
I don't disagree with you. I think one of the reasons I do this in long form is it is very difficult to get depth if I was just asking one question in a few seconds or a few minutes or 10, 15 minutes. You're not going to be able to get to in depth. Of course, there is a, if I ask you five questions, you spend 10 minutes answering them, it's already 50 minutes, right? But then it helps you understand and go deep. What is the role of these newsletters and podcasting? Because I see these two forms. I've started one. I am talking to people like you and everyone else in the city. I'm giving voice to people who don't generally, I wouldn't say not appear on the newspapers, but they may have, but this stays in posterity. They're working on certain things, and we can delve deep into this. Of course, like you said, patience is a virtue a lot of people don't have, but it doesn't matter. The content is that we allow for a deep dive of a discussion. I've also heard of many documentaries getting shut down. I think Nat Geo, I'm not very sure if, I think they as a magazine are going out, but a lot of huge nice documentaries that I view from outside the country doesn't see funding here, so you're not getting quality content at all. Long form quality content, does it still have a place? Does our 1 hour podcast still have a place? Does a DW documentary or a BBC documentary still have a place? Because there seems to be such a rush to cater to the 3 second, 10 second shorts. They have their place. They can't be the only one. So where do you see long form and good quality content going?
Yeah, there is an audience for serious stuff. It has always been there. Now, how do you empower these voices? Of course, a person will come and listen to your 1 hour podcast, but he gains a lot of knowledge from that. Can he make sense of it and try to disseminate the same information in ways which can reach many more people? If 500 people watch your podcast, if each of those 500 people can amplify it in their own individual ways, simplify concepts in ways which appeal to them, which directly affect
Mm.
their impact their lives, then I think this kind of content still have a place. You mentioned about documentaries. For instance, if you look at that elephant documentary which won the Oscar, and there's so much of buzz around the documentary after winning the Oscar, and just imagine if you had something like that, an incentive. Oscar is an incentive, but the thing is, if you have a local desi kind of thing, of course, we have a ecosystem already. Award ecosystem is very vocal and very visible in, so try to build the same for documentaries. Give it glitz and glamour or whatever is needed to push it. And I'm sure that really good stories will start coming into mainstream and appealing to all kinds of people. Why don't we build, get students to make these documentaries? Make them be part of it. Let
Mm.
the maestros work with these smaller students. Smaller colleges and schools and colleges, and try to amplify the message through multiple ways. The platforms are exploding in creativity, innovations. So are the students. So I feel a synergizing from all directions can appeal and also drive the popularity.
Of
The same
course.
argument for good quality journalism as well. I'm sure
Mm.
any good stories, even if it is in a small platform, gets picked up by a mainstream platform and gets amplified, provided that original story is really good and original.
If the technology has allowed people like me who has not gone through journalism training the ability to ask questions and elicit a response and convey information to people, what additional are we starting off many people at the same level? So is there a difference between new journalists coming out of a journalism school and people who have access to, of course there will be some difference in how you do it, but what is the distinction getting blurred? Because the lot more people today can use this. Of course how responsibly or irresponsibly they use it is something. So if you talked about citizen journalism, they may not have a press pass, but if they went through a small finisher course on how to tell a story, you just created that many more people, and then it is just about where do I publish this, and it's a game of aggregation at the end of the day. What happens, senior journalists of course will still be there, but what happens to a new journalist or somebody who wants to study journalism? Is that even a thing anymore?
When I look at the journalism schools, the people getting into the media field is definitely coming down, especially the print. One reason for it is the monetary benefits, right? You need to be extremely rich to be a journalist, to not be affected by what the newspapers pay. When you're a journalist, unless you are driven by passion to change society in some way, you also look at the remuneration. This is where it's making a big shift is being seen. You know, the journalists are paid relatively much lower than all other fields. It has always been the case, but then it's becoming more and more acute. So I feel some kind of intervention in some fashion, I think should happen. Otherwise, finishing school students, I don't think much hope in getting into a mainstream newspaper. Even they are finding it tough to get good talent. So there are a lot of interns who come into newspapers. They get inspired by the workings, but then they use it just as a passing phase before they do a post graduation and move on. They hardly come back. Eventually many of these reporters who get hired, because they end up getting only leftovers, and the quality, most of them can't even write or make sense of what's happening and put it in a way which is accessible to everybody. So imagine the state when a few years from now they become decision makers in newspapers. And imagine the kind of editorials they will write, the kind of direction they'll give to the newspaper. So unless they invest in good talent, and they look at ways to attract them. Of course, monetary is one aspect of it, but also if you can evolve the platform in such a way it appeals to all kinds of generations, right, from teenagers
Mhm.
to adults to the old timers who, in any case, will buy a newspaper. I think it's going to be tough for the newspapers, and this 5 to 10 year window I gave can become even shorter if they don't move with the times now.
You called it a newspaper, I would call it a news organization, because if they are tapping multimedia, it's not just about a newspaper, it's about becoming a news organization or an. Do you see this becoming a gig instead of an employment kind of a thing? Should news agencies even employ people? Can they not, for example, pay me to do a podcast on something, or write me an article, I'll pay you for those, and then you just aggregate many. Of course, you will still have to do editorial and stand by the content and all of those things. I There are guest columns being written, but wouldn't that be a model for them to explore? Is maybe don't have so much of anyway. You said they are reducing the reportage, but why aren't they? Why I'm saying that is there's a lot more. I don't call it reporting. I wouldn't call it journalism. There's a lot more writing. There's a lot more content that is being generated outside of the news organizations itself. How can they be tapped into by the news organization and put that cover of editorial and say, I find this valuable enough? It happens with the edit page, op-eds, right? I mean, you still invite people to do such things. Do you see a place where more and more other people writing things without having to be employed?
That is happening, but the thing is, how much are you willing to pay them? And there is one more problem. So, a particular newspaper, you identify with a particular stance. It could be politically or otherwise.
Hmm.
Now, you can always ask a guest to write, and then at end of it, you can say these views don't necessarily is synced with the newspapers or news organizations. I feel they have to look at the balance: 30% outsiders and 70% within, or it could go up to 60% inside and 40% outside. But then, unless the same what you talk about talent vis-a-vis money, you don't get good writers if you pay them peanuts. Of course, there are people who won't mind, but then they'll come with an agenda. Now, how do you make these decisions? How do you build on it? Most of these people are not bound by time and deadlines. And a news organization, for them, deadlines and relevance of a particular story is extremely important. Now you can
Hmm.
ask your reporters to deliver on time or his job is on fire. You can't say that to a contributor. He'll move to
Hmm.
another platform. Now you have to strike a balance. If you build a network of contributors which is oriented towards your organization, I think there is a way, but it will be tricky to go beyond 30%.
That's interesting, because the reason I was asking is there's so much content out there. I think it's just going to give, I wouldn't say a fight for organizations, but it's also increasingly appearing that where is this funding going to come from to survive for these news organizations? And many senior journalists like yourself and everybody else are also getting into their own brands, and for what it is worth, people still have their following, and like you said, and listen to them. And there are lots of non-journalist things. So that comes back to my question of these journalism schools and what they impart versus if a citizen journalist or somebody who wants to write, and let me just say some people who want to write some good content, if they can just, do they need to go through a journalism school, or can they just take a 1 week refresher and be good enough to contribute at the level of journalists? And that doesn't that mean that trained journalists who go through school don't need to do that anymore? Is that a disincentive to do journalism schools anymore? Are they adding more value? Because I don't know, I've not been through a journalism school. I don't know if it is worth doing that at all, if there's so much content being generated, some whose quality might be quite good. Of course, like you said, timeliness and things are different, and sticking to the slant that a news organization will have is one. I'm just putting it out there and asking you, would that even be useful thing for a lot of journalists, a lot of citizens to get into reporting or not reporting and making their own analysis and stating their bias? I only know this much, but I see what is happening, and here it is.
No, if you look at many of the newspapers, they have many journalists who make a story weaving two or three tweets into a few images and come out of the story. This anybody can do. I know if you are very good at your platform, if you are a very good communicator, you know how the different technologies can be linked, different narratives can be linked in interesting ways which appeals to everybody. which is accessible to even the most lay of persons, I feel everybody can be a journalist. Of course, there are certain basic traits. Okay? You give voice to multiple sides of the same story, uh, verify your facts. So these are things which can be, of course, learned in a few weeks. But then the challenge is being in sticking to it for every story, day after day, week after week. You know, so when you have a hierarchy, a semblance of a hierarchy, I don't believe in hierarchies, but at least a system needs to be in place to ensure that there's a flow of information, data analysis in a very structured way. I mean, if you build in, this is how brands are built. There's a method in everything, right? So
Mm.
newspapers are realizing that the method they mastered through print journalism is not working anymore. So they're trying to learn
Mhm.
from other social media or digital media influencers how to try to create a different kind of platform. Storytelling is the essence of journalism. How good you do it, through what platform, it all depends on you. And then if you want to get trained in that, I don't think it can be, it's rocket science. I feel it can be learned in a few weeks. If you are telling a story, every story assumes that after the story something happens. Like if we are talking about a problem, you assume that it will go to many more people and they will act in a way which the government will be forced to react and solve
Mhm.
the problem. Now, as individuals, can you do that? As many individuals collectively, can you do that? Or is it better to give it to a platform which is, of course, it could be a legacy platform which has been there for decades, or a new platform which is creating a lot of buzz? We need to look in, factor in all these issues, and also ultimately give a thought to how much is this government, both at the state and the center, is willing to give you that freedom to make your stories that impact everybody.
So the not just about the access to the people and getting the inside information, but it's also about would they muzzle you easier if you didn't have a press pass, right? You're just a citizen and somebody could just get after you if you say anything beyond just reporting my road is bad, right? If you get into anything beyond that, you may be hassled a little more than if you are affiliated or accredited to something who has some immunity as the fourth estate or whatever. Uh, the interesting thing I want to get to is to say, what is the impact that you mentioned about newspapers or news organization writing it in a certain way and creating uh, action at the end of it, the outcomes at the end of it, right? In your journey of reporting civic issues, I can vouch for the fact that the more you all write in the media, and I was saying this to some of these people as well, is that unless you are appearing there in the newspapers, and even in my cycling advocacy I say, unless, because the newspapers are there in the decision maker's desk as a force of habit, and also as a representation of this, and of course the TV is also playing some of their favorite channels. Unless you are in that, the action doesn't happen. Have you seen the government stance change after the electronic media and the internet reporting has come? Does the written words, or let's not call it written word, does the mainstream media still have the same impact, or is it diluted, or is it, will they still do the same things they used to do when you used to write earlier, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
No, there are stories coming up in mainstream newspapers. Many of the big stories are broken first on newspapers. They still do. And then because many of these news platforms have mastered to be in social media, they have their own social media channels,
Hmm.
and even the reporters are reporting on it are now more and more getting connected. So I feel there are a lot of stories which has come out. Even in Bangalore, if you look at, there are many
Hmm.
stories which are broken. Of course, I wouldn't say all newspapers, but there are some newspapers. There are some news reporters who are chasing stories, bringing out corrupt practices in
Hmm.
different government departments, and then of course applying through RTI and whatever it comes out of it. So there are news breaks happening, and there is some impact. Thanks also due to so many elections now coming one after the other. Every year there's an election. They are forced to respond to certain news breaks, and thankfully corruption had become an election issue last year, so you play on that. So when you win a election based on corruption, you the number of fingers pointing at your deeds or misdeeds increases. Okay, and many of those fingers are newspapers and journalists. So we have not yet reached that dead end. There is still hope. There are still voices within, but only thing is we are talking about tomorrow. Are we arming the journalists enough to make these choices and empowering them to ask the right questions, to elicit the right answers from the government? Are we representing the common man's problems in a way which is powerful enough for the government to react? Otherwise, in due course, the government will find ways to weaken all these platforms one by one,
Yeah.
either through
Yeah.
rules or through resources. They can cut the newsprint supply, they can increase the newsprint costs, they can reduce the government ad rates. There are multiple ways to control a newspaper, and there are so many rules coming where it's getting increasingly difficult to tell a story in the way it used to be before. But then, if there is a way to get out of it through empowered leadership within and outside the newspapers, I think there is still hope.
On that note, Rashid, I did make this point of the fourth estate and the fourth pillar when I introed this whole thing. Nothing can replace that. The press still has a role to hold the government accountable. All of the citizen journalists and all of the technology can only uh, aid on the 30% side of things to make sure that some extra coverage is being gotten and some things that are being missed are also brought to the notice. But at the end of the day, the press pass has the power to make changes and do the change. We could talk all we want on a podcast, but nobody is listening to Satya and saying, okay, he said so, we have to act. That's not happening. But if the press does it, there is a certain amount of respect because you're holding them accountable, and there is a logical linkage between saying that something that appears in the press needs to be taken seriously because it is kind of like the pillar that holds the society together. And I think, and in that level, I really appreciate you coming on the show and helping shine a light on all of this, Rashid. It's been very illuminating for me to see how newspapers are going to, or news organizations, I should say, are shaping up. There will be a flux, and yeah, the paper form, you're giving it 10, I'd give it far less. It's not been seen in my home for many years, and the TV has not been seen in my home for more than a decade now. And there are quite a few of them I speak to who have discarded some of these things already. But information needs to reach people, and I think I hope this podcast has helped clarify a lot of these things. This is a call out to viewers to like, subscribe, and share these videos so we can get more interesting guests and throw some light on these topics. See you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.